Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we're talking to Elizabeth Tsurkov, a research fellow at the Forum for Regional Thinking, where she focuses on Syria. How's it going?
It's going relatively okay.
It's nice to chat. I think the last time we spoke, we were in an undisclosed Middle Eastern country talking about northeast Syria, and I think today we're going to be talking about northwest Syria.
Yes, exactly. Very different situation. Northeast, much more stable. Northwest, on fire.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for listeners, we're going to be zeroing in on Idlib, which is, I think, it's the largest Arab majority opposition to the Assad regime, and it's come under bombardment recently. But this has really been like something that's been, I want to say, like a year in the making in terms of what's been going on here. So perhaps we start at around 1 year ago today. How did we get here today with the Assad regime taking a city and threatening to push further north?
So basically, we are basically now in the middle of a campaign launched by the regime in Russia at the end of April. At the end of April, basically a de-escalation zone deal that was made in Sochi finally collapsed after it was constantly being violated by both sides, both the opposition and the regime. The regime would shell the area, and the opposition under the deal was supposed to, the jihadist factions were supposed to withdraw from a demilitarized zone surrounding Idlib, and also allow the regime the use of M4 and M5 international highways that connect regime-held areas to Aleppo and also to Latakia. So both sides did not uphold the agreement. There was occasional shelling, there was occasional strikes. Rebel factions would fire rockets, including on the Hmimim base in Latakia, where Russian forces are based. And basically it led to the collapse of this de-escalation deal. And the initial campaign lasted until around Eid al-Adha, so lasted for about 3 months. Then there was a brief ceasefire of 2-3 days, and then the ceasefire collapsed. And since then, it's been 2.5 weeks. We've seen basically very quick, significant regime advances against the opposition, whereas in the first 3 months of the campaign, starting at the end of April, regime progress was very limited, very slow. They did make gains, but the opposition was able to hold off the regime. They lost 2 major points, Qalat al-Madiq and Kafr Nabuda, but other than that, they were able to hold the line. But since then, since the end of the ceasefire, in just 2.5 weeks, they lost a lot more than they lost in the previous 3 months. And regime forces are essentially advancing now towards, they are now already inside Idlib governorate and advancing north.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can unpack this, because for people who follow you on Twitter, they'll know that you had a really good thread on this, but sort of the reasons why after the ceasefire that you mentioned, that the regime and with Russian backing was able to advance more quickly. What's happening on the ground that allowed this, and perhaps, what does it mean?
So the regime was really struggling in the first 3 months of the offensive, regime and Russian-backed forces. Iran is not participating in the offensive, and this is a major factor for the relatively slow advance of the regime since April, because forces loyal to Iran, Hezbollah and other militias are quite adept at fighting the rebels. They, for example, were instrumental in the battle for Aleppo city around Homs. But in this battle, Iran essentially chose not to participate in the fight for Idlib. It doesn't seem like a priority for Tehran. And also it wants to maintain a good relationship with Turkey, which is protecting the area. So the regime has to rely on its own forces and forces that have been trained by Russia, including the Tiger forces led by Suhail al-Hassan, that received significant Russian training in recent years. Initially, the regime struggled to make progress, but it was able to inflict a great deal of losses on the opposition, and particularly opposition factions and subunits that are experienced at fighting along front lines. Naturally, the opposition placed those fighters in the front lines, and they were able to hold off the regime. But they took on a lot of losses in that process. Over 1,500 fighters were killed during the 3 months of the initial offensive. And this is according to Abdullah al-Muhaysini, who is a cleric close to the jihadist factions operating in Idlib. So entire subunits of Jaish al-Izza, which is a major kind of FSA, Free Syrian Army aligned rebel faction, lost entire units. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham also lost entire units of fighters. Many fighters also have been injured, so they are not able to fight anymore. In fact, many of the contacts with whom I'm in touch right now in Idlib, they are these injured fighters, because the fighters on the front lines, they don't have phones, and often, even if they have phones, they don't have reception. So I often rely on their friends who are in the who are recuperating back, and there are large numbers of those fighters. So the opposition lost a great deal of experienced fighters who are able to fight on the front lines. There are tens of thousands of rebels in Idlib, but many of them don't have much frontline experience. They sit at checkpoints, they lob Grad missiles, they use ATGMs. They are not adapted fighting under such intense airstrikes that Russia has been utilizing in this campaign. And as a result, simply rebel ranks they don't have enough fighters on the front line. And the regime, on the other hand, is able to rotate forces because the regime is concentrating solely on fighting in Idlib. ISIS is running wild in the Badia right now, in the Homs Desert, in Deir ez-Zor, and the regime is not paying much attention to that, is focused on Idlib. So the regime was able to replace its forces. In addition to that, the regime forces have undergone training by Russia in recent months in particular that allow them to fight. They're simply better fighters than they were a year ago. In the past, the opposition would often utilize suicide vehicle-borne IDs, SVB IDs, to target the regime. And after they would deploy such a car and kill, dozens of soldiers would retreat. And the rebels would actually be able to advance. Now, not only do they not retreat, but they also launch new offensive just hours after being hit by such car bombs. In addition to that, regime fighters are now the elite units in the pro-regime forces and its militias and army are now able to fight at night as well. They've received training. They have night vision scopes and goggles, and they are able to fight in such conditions, whereas in the past they were not able to do so, and the rebels would utilize nighttime to regain losses that they've made during the day, because the regime does not bomb at night. Jets are not equipped to bomb at night. So now the rebels are losing during the day, and they're losing during night as well. In addition to that, the ceasefire itself and its collapse had a significant mental effect on fighters. They felt, after the 3 months of being able to hold the line and getting the ceasefire, they felt victorious. And the leadership of the factions also felt victorious. We saw it clearly in the press conference that Al-Julani gave, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the lead, kind of the dominant group in Idlib. They were very happy with themselves, with what they've been able to achieve in the 3 months to hold off the regime, to kind of force the regime, they felt, to into a ceasefire deal. And then suddenly the decision of the regime to again escalate and again start an offensive was just such a blow to their morale. They felt suddenly that their analysis, their perception of reality is completely undermined. And this is something that I'm observing as the offensive continues and as they incur more and more losses, that the morale on the side of the opposition is, of course, collapsing. There's a great deal of fear. A lot of civilians are fleeing north. They basically lost faith in the ability of the rebels to hold the line and prevent their towns from being occupied by the regime and pro-Russian militias.
I wanted to pivot now and talk about sort of the Russian-Turkish agreement, where the two sides had reached an agreement, I believe it was last September, one outcome of which was observation posts placed around the entirety of the Idlib pocket. And now what's happened is that the regime is ignoring the Turkish observation posts, which were designed to deter any type of regime attack. And one of those posts have now become besieged by the regime. And so you have a geopolitical dynamic coming in here that's now drawn in the Russians, obviously, which are combatant with the regime, and the Turks, who are sort of now literally under fire, at least in one place, probably in two, as they try to manage the situation.
Yeah, so I think the Turks would actually be lucky if the regime simply ignored their posts. The regime is bombing their posts, and they in the past week, they inserted additional forces to reinforce existing observation posts that were placed in Idlib in accordance with the Sochi agreement. And they are now, the Turks are basically, they've escalated, they brought in additional forces. But then to protect these forces or to prevent future regime advances, they need to escalate even further, because the regime is clearly not deterred by these additional convoys or by the existence of these posts. And indeed, the point in Morek in Hama, in northern Hama countryside, is now besieged. And now there are negotiations ongoing regarding the future of this point and, in general, this pocket of northern Hama countryside that is now falling under siege, basically, by the regime. It's basically the population in Idlib is trying to understand what will happen to them, and it is entirely out of their hands. They see that there are negotiations between Russia and Turkey. Turkey has a clear interest in preventing the collapse of the Idlib pocket, because there are 3 million people who live there, 3 million civilians, and among them there are several tens of thousands of fighters, and among those there are several thousands of jihadists. And Turkey is absolutely not interested in that population fleeing across the border. Now, the border with Turkey is locked, but if the regime continues to advance, and we see that the advance of the regime is accompanied by a scorched earth policy. Essentially, the population is displaced. The population does not remain and just, they become residents of regime-held territory. They flee. So the now shrinking pocket of Idlib is becoming more and more crowded. At some point, if the regime continues to advance, they will become right along the border, and Turkey will want to avoid any kind of situation of people trying to force their way into Turkey. And if they are desperate, they may do so, because it's important to remember that Idlib is different from all other rebel-held pockets and areas that were previously captured by the regime. In those areas, Daraa, Eastern Ghouta, northern Homs countryside, people had the option of either remaining and reconciling with the regime, in quotation marks, meaning surrendering to the regime, or basically being displaced to Idlib. Now there is no Idlib to which you can deport people. So all those people who refuse reconciliation with the regime, fighters, their families, activists, people involved in local councils, all these people are now living in Idlib. So there's a large, half of the population in Idlib are people displaced from other areas. Many of them will refuse to live under the regime. In addition, the population that is in Idlib originally, also many of them will refuse to live under the regime, will refuse to reconcile with the regime, and the regime will also see them as a suspect and treat them accordingly. So they know what awaits them. They know what is happening in other reconciliation areas, in places like Dar'a, where there are arrests on a daily basis, where people are living in constant fear of the regime. They know what happens in regime prisons. They know that there is large-scale extermination of human beings in those prisons, and they prefer to fight to the death rather than surrender and then be tortured to death. I mean, it is easier to be killed by a bullet. So this is a recipe for a catastrophe. So either we're going to see mass slaughter, or we're going to see people breaching the border. And it's important to remember that, some of the factions operating in Idlib have tanks. They have the tools necessary to pull down the border if necessary. If people feel desperate that they have nowhere to go to, this is a scenario that may happen. And this, of course, something that for Turkey is an absolute catastrophe. And this is why it protected this area thus far. But now, with the regime offensive and with Russian confidence and regime confidence, Turkey needs to further escalate to prevent, continuous regime gains and advances.
And if they don't escalate?
If they don't escalate, the regime is determined to continue to retake all of Syria, Idlib, and also areas under control of the Syrian Democratic Forces. If the regime is allowed to do whatever it wants, it will go in to Idlib, take all of it, and slaughter the people who oppose it, whether it does so by bullets to the head or by detaining them and then executing them or torturing them to death in Sednaya and other prisons. So this is, we're talking about a humanitarian emergency right now in Idlib because there's mass flight of civilians. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced. But this situation is fantastic compared to what will happen if the regime takes over all of this territory and people have nowhere to flee. And Turkey, of course, does not want to allow these people to cross, does not even want them to cross into areas that are inside Syria and are under direct Turkish control, northern Aleppo area and Afrin. So we're talking about a crisis situation that unfortunately is not receiving much attention. People are used to, things are getting bombed in Syria. But we're now really talking about if the regime continues to advance, this is going to be the worst massacre in the history of this war that has seen many, many massacres already.
As we pivot to the end, I mean, that's a rather grim scenario you point out. And I don't disagree with any of it. I think it's all correct. Is what we have seen, sort of if the regime follows its playbook, is that there may be another effort between the Russians and the Turks that allows the regime, I would even call it for like an operational pause, but anything that the two sides agree to usually breaks down because neither side can deliver the other, i.e. the Turks can't really deliver the opposition and the Russians can't really deliver the regime. But if you had to project forward 6 months, where are we 6 months from now? So as we begin pivoting into the new year, looking forward, is the regime controlling those highways? Have we stopped? Have the Turks escalated? I mean, and then, what does that mean for the people inside this pocket?
Well, I mean, there's a saying in Hebrew that prophecy was given to the fools. So it's, in general, prophesying is not a good idea, and in Syria in particular. But still, I will attempt to do so. I think that the regime will be stopped at some point. I hope that this will happen for the sake of civilians there. Maybe after taking basically southern Idlib, the area of Ma'arat al-Nu'man, at that point it will stop before reaching larger population centers such as Ariha, such as Idlib city. This will require Turkey to do something to stop this continuous advance. And for the population living there, it means that even a larger share of the population, right now we're talking about 3 million civilians who live there, now half of them are displaced. A larger share of them will be displaced. More people dependent on aid, more people, cut off from their sources of livelihood, such as agriculture, such as shops. A region, highly dense area, being ruled over by quite an extremist organization. I think that we've seen in recent years, particularly in recent months, a process of Hayat Tahrir Sham is, the jihadist faction that is the dominant one in Idlib, is undergoing a process of growing pragmatism. They are interested in taking part in negotiation. They are engaged with Turkey. I think that possibly after a new deal is established, they will be more willing to behave as is expected of them, because they realize that if they don't, they simply don't have the military power to hold off the regime. So they need to more closely adhere to Turkish demands and expectations of them. And we're already seeing signs of that in recent speeches that were given by Jolani and others. They're adopting a much almost secular rhetoric in some respects. In the past, for example, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the previous version of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, used to kidnap foreigners. Now they are inviting foreign journalists to come in and showing them around. They are interested in establishing contact with the outside world. They understand the importance of that. The most radical elements within the organization have been killed off or split off into Huras al-Din, which is now the official Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. So this process of pragmatization will likely accelerate after they've been cut down to size and they truly understand that their military might is not sufficient to hold off the regime.
This is a grim scenario, for what it's worth.
Yes, we will be essentially looking at the best case scenario is kind of a Gaza 2.0 situation for Idlib. And this is the best case scenario, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just a bad outcome for everybody involved. But with that, I think we should wrap up. I mean, thanks for taking the time and coming on the show and walking us through everything that's been happening in Idlib. And it's certainly something we'll all be watching over the next 6 months to a year.
Thank you so much.
And thanks everybody for listening.